They're my contact details. I'm pretty easy to find because I've got quite a unique name. So whatever is your favorite means of social media, I am pretty much there. So feel free to reach out. I'd also like to introduce you all to Stefania. Steph is one of the dietitians who works with me at our practice in Melbourne, and we do virtual consultations both all around Australia and also internationally now as well. So to get started, the first thing that I really want to point out is that there's a massive lack of research when it comes to Meniere's and diet. And the big thing that I see from the evidence and from the little bit of experience that I do have is that whenever you look on different associations, support groups or chat groups and so forth, there's a lot of people saying, oh, I did this, you should try this, or these are our guidelines, and everybody with Meniere should do this. But I think one of the key things that we need to remember is that Meniere is believed to be a condition that has not just one cause, but potentially up to 10 different causes that affect the inner ear and manifest with similar symptoms. So what that means is that what one dietary treatment works for one person doesn't necessarily mean that that same dietary treatment is going to work for the next person. So if I can give you one key takeaway message tonight, I really encourage you to methodically work through different dietary modifications and do them in a really systematic fashion and figure out which of those work for you as an individual. Because, like I said, what works for one person is going to be different than what works for the next. And you really need to do it in a systematic way. So what I mean by that is that, one of the most common things that you hear about in terms of Meniere's and diet is a sodium restriction, which we'll talk about in a minute. So you might put yourself onto a sodium restriction for a period of time and then go off it for a period of time and then go back on it again for a period of time and go off it again for a period of time. So, and then while you're on it and while you're off it, I'd really encourage you to keep a little journal of symptoms and when your Meniere's is exacerbated, and just see if you can identify any patterns there. Because as you'll see when we get to the low sodium part, there's a whole massive range of different recommendations out there. So that's why I really believe that it's about figuring out what works for you as an individual. Okie dokie, so let's get into some of the recommended dietary treatment options. And just actually one more thing before I do is just to say my plan for tonight is just to go through the most common treatment recommendations, and then I've been sent a whole lot of questions before the presentation, so thank you very much for sending those through. So then I'll go through all of those Q&As, and feel free to either post questions in the chat box as I go through for me to answer at the end, or else open for questions at the end as well, because I'd love to answer your questions for you. So the first thing that I want to comment about is fluid modification, and already this is where you'll see differences in advice. So some research papers and some people you'll hear talking about the fact that too much fluid can exacerbate vertigo, and that you need to be on a fluid restriction. Now, if you are going to go onto a fluid restriction, then the key thing that I want you to remember is that fluid isn't just water. It also includes things like soups and juices and milk, and even foods that become liquid in the mouth. So things like ice cream, yogurt, and foods along those lines. So keep that in mind. A fluid restriction, again, how much is a fluid restriction? That is also debated, and it will depend upon your weight. So we need to remember that about 60% of our body is fluid. And as we get through the presentation in a minute, we'll soon talk about carbohydrate, and you'll see how your carbohydrate intake also impacts, and sodium and salt as well, how they both impact upon fluid as well. So as I said, some people are recommending a fluid restriction. So yeah, it can be down to your weight. So you might have heard people saying that everybody should be drinking 2 litres of water a day. Why people say 2 litres of water or 8 glasses, it might be another thing that you've heard, is that that's actually based on Australian guidelines that say that we should be having around 35 mils per kilogram per day. So if you have somebody who is, I should have my calculator here, say they're 60 kilograms, they weigh 60 kilograms, and I multiply 60 kilograms by 35 mils, I get 2.1. So that's 2.1 litre, or I get 2,100. So that's 2.1 litres of fluid a day that person should be having. But then if you get someone who is 100 kilograms, then 100 times 35 is 3.5. So ideally, they'd be having around 3.5 litres a day. So you can see how the amount of fluid that most people need will vary depending upon our body weight. So it's the same thing if you are thinking about a fluid restriction, or if you're talking about increasing your fluid as well. So you might find that many ENTs in particular recommend a very high fluid intake, usually of 4 litres plus a day. Now, again, that will depend upon a range of things. It will depend upon the treatments that you're having. So if you're on diuretics, for example, will impact upon your healthcare professional's recommendation about whether you should be restricting fluid or having more fluid. And it will also be impacted by your body weight. So just a few things to think about there. All right, so number 2 kind of goes on from that, which is salt or sodium. So sodium is a part of salt. It is, so the technical chemical name for salt is sodium chloride. So it's actually made up of 2 chemicals, which sounds terrible, but your 2 chemical compounds joined together, the sodium and the chloride. And the sodium accounts for about 40% of the sodium chloride compound. It's obviously mainly used to add flavour to food, but because salt increases thirst, it plays a really important role in fluid regulation. And so that fluid regulation impacts the size of your blood vessels, and the inner ear, which obviously helps to govern balance, is particularly sensitive to changes in blood vessel size and blood flow. So this is why salt restriction may be beneficial for you. Now, I said that there was a little bit of controversy around this as well, and this is again why you'll hear some of your, I'm going to call them colleagues, some of your other people, like people in the support group and other people that you know, talking about that they're going on and trialing different amounts of salt restrictions, and the different healthcare professionals are giving different recommendations about how much salt you should be having as well. And again, this is where I think that it's really important for you to come back to those key messages of, 1, looking at yourself as an individual, because things like whether you're taking diuretics or not will have a big impact on how much you need to reduce your salt by. And number 2, your body weight. Number 3, how much physical activity you do. Like if you're losing a lot of salt through things like sweating, that's something else to consider. And then number 4, how much fluid you drink. So all of these things will have an impact on the recommendation that you need for how much salt you should be having or restricting to. Now, it's also interesting, I think, to note that a stable salt diet may be effective and maybe even more sustainable than a salt restriction. So in a minute, I'm going to go through a bit more about what a salt stable diet is, and then also what a salt restrictive diet is. But first of all, I just wanted to give you some numbers to put it all into perspective. So first of all, 1 teaspoon of salt usually contains around 2,300 milligrams of sodium. And it's the sodium in particular that we're wanting to look at. Now, general Australian guidelines recommend that we should be consuming less than 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day anyway, that everybody should be doing that as part of a healthy diet. Saying that though, again, I might point out, just to make things even more complicated, is that the reason why our Australian guidelines recommend that we should be moderating the amount of salt in our diet are for a couple of reasons. Number one, and probably the most important reason, is that having too much sodium is related to increasing blood pressure, which is related to increasing people's risk of heart disease and stroke. Now, it's interesting to note that that isn't the case for everybody. So some people are salt sensitive and other people aren't salt sensitive at all. And it actually comes down to our genes. So, and the reason why our population guidelines recommend that as a population, we should be keeping our salt intake low is because that kind of is the most common sense message across the population. But in fact, if you're somebody who isn't salt sensitive, then you can eat as much salt as you like and it's not going to impact your blood pressure at all. And so same thing for people with Meniere's. If you're not a salt sensitive person, and I might just point out that, again, there's not enough research to say this categorically, but just interpreting the research that I have done, I'm pretty confident that if you're not a salt sensitive person, then a salt restriction won't have any benefit for you. So general guidelines are that we should consume less than 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. The average Aussie consumes around 3,600 milligrams of sodium per day. Now, the reason for the fact that most Aussies have a fairly high salt diet is that salt is used as a preservative in many foods, and so any food that is pre-prepared often has sodium chloride or salt in it, and that's everything from, like, it doesn't just have to be burgers and pizza, but everything from cheese and bread and crackers and a lot of those kind of everyday foods also contain salt. So to have a low salt diet, I'm sure many of you know, is quite challenging. Now, consuming 100 milligrams of sodium is equal to about 1 cup of fluid retention. So that's how you can kind of gauge how, like, that you might be able to figure out a little bit in terms of, if you are going to look at the numbers, in terms of working out what your sodium restriction should be for you. Now, if you are going to try a low sodium diet, personally what I would do is start as low as possible. So usually the recommendations are, and I say that, but then I also, again, looking at both the research and hearing other specialists talk, I have heard a variety of different recommendations. But yeah, usually I think aiming for less than 800 milligrams of sodium a day is a good place to start for a sodium restriction. And then if you find that works, then maybe you might like to try a little bit higher. So yeah, kind of be most restrictive first. And so then you might try 1,000 milligrams and then try 1,200 milligrams and so forth and work your way up. Now, what does a high sodium diet look like versus a low sodium diet? So as I said, the biggest differences are how many processed foods that you've got in your diet. So I've just got a couple of examples here. This person hasn't eaten a whole lot of food. In the low sodium diet version here, you can see this person has probably eaten more food, really, or at least just as much. But the foods tend to be a lot more natural, like a lot more whole foods. So you can see that those foods are all really low in sodium. And so it's just about committing to a lot of home cooking. And the problem becomes when you actually want to not just do this for a week or two, but make it a lifelong dietary change. And that's where it gets tricky, because it really makes it difficult to go to somebody's wedding or go out with friends for a celebration or just live life. Now, you may, instead of needing a salt restrictive diet, this is why you may be better off with a salt stable diet. So what do I mean by a salt stable diet? Essentially working out what's going to be the level of sodium that you feel best at, and B, the level of sodium that is actually going to suit your lifestyle that you can manage, rather than trying to get your sodium levels down as low as you possibly can, just making it more realistic for you and making it something that you can stick to may be a better solution for you. So what we do know is that the more variation that you have in your sodium levels from day to day, the more likely you are to have an exacerbation of your symptoms. So like I said, if you're somebody who is maybe on a 1,000 milligrams of sodium restricted diet per day, and then you've been doing that every day for months or even years, and then all of a sudden you decide to go out and treat yourself and have a celebration for a day, and your sodium levels might double up to 2,000 or 2,500 or even more. Maybe you go out and have a pizza or something along those lines, then there's a good chance that you might really cause yourself a lot of symptoms. And so this is where, again, a salt stable diet may be a better option for you. The second thing is to limit your variation throughout the day. So it's not just about keeping under your sodium limit per day. It's about really managing it across the day as well. So what you don't want to be doing is eating fruit and veggies all day and then going out for a pizza for dinner. That, again, is more likely to exacerbate your symptoms. So what can often be a good regime for some people is around 1,500 milligrams of salt restriction. So it's still a salt restricted diet, but it's not as low as a less than 800 milligram salt restriction, and aiming for around 300 milligrams for main meals and around 150 milligrams of sodium per snack. But like I said, this is where you really need to do the experimentation and figure out what's going to work best for you. You need to, again, just as a reminder, you need to look at things like how much physical activity you're doing, how much fluid you're drinking, what your weight is, just your lifestyle as well. Are you doing shift work, or are you organizing meals for your family? Like, it's all very well just to say, I'm not going to eat these foods, but we all have to live life, and when we're talking about doing this long term, we need to be practical as well. The other really important thing to think about when you're thinking about salt restriction is, are you on diuretics? Because diuretics will also reduce your sodium levels. And so if you're having diuretics combined with a low salt diet, you actually may even drop your sodium levels too low, so that you end up with what's called hyponatremia. And with hyponatremia, you may find that you get a bit of dizziness, that you become really fatigued, that you get confusion, So they're all symptoms to look out for. So like I said, you're trying to figure out what level of sodium restriction works for you as an individual, and then look at trying to, best as you can, maintain that as evenly as you can. All right, so this brings me to number 3, which is again about that even, stable distribution. So meal spacing, and just bring it back to really practical things. So it can be hard to do with everybody's busy lifestyles, but the more that you can space your meals really evenly throughout the day, the better that it's likely to be for your Menieres. Because no matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about fluid or sodium or sugar or carbohydrate, the more stable that they can be throughout the day, the more stable that your fluid levels are going to be, and particularly when we're talking about these fine blood vessels in the ear. So if you can, the ideal scenario would be to be having eating around every 3 to 5 hours is usually what I recommend. And so if you're starting your day eating brekkie at 5 and then having lunch at 1, then you're probably going to need a morning tea snack. But if you're somebody who is having brekkie at 9 and then having lunch at 12, then you're probably not going to need a morning tea snack. So just figure out your pattern and then try the best that you can to stick to those meal times on a daily basis, and that includes weekends as well. So try and make your eating pattern as realistic as possible. So part of that is carbohydrates, and I noticed in the questions that there's quite a few questions about sugar as well. So the reason why carbohydrate distribution is quite important, I believe, is because carbohydrate intake can also impact upon your fluid balance. So I get a lot of clients, not necessarily many as clients, but just clients for different things, who come and ask me about keto diets, and they're obviously been quite popular over the last few years. And I love to tell a little story. I was driving along one day and driving past a pharmacy, and they had this ad on the window for one of their meal replacement programs. I think it was Tony Ferguson, and the meal replacement, and the ad said, we guarantee that you'll lose at least 1 kilogram in the first week, or you'll get your money back. And as a dietitian, I had a little chuckle to myself, because I thought, oh, that's clever marketing, because meal replacements, all meal replacement programs are low carbohydrate. And I know that whenever you cut the carbs out of your diet, and so you go keto, that you lose all of your carbohydrate stores in your muscles and your liver in the first few days. And then when you lose those carbohydrate stores, that for every gram of carbohydrates stored in your muscles and liver, that's attached to 3 grams of fluid. And so you lose all of that fluid weight as well. And so that's why when people go on something like a keto diet, they lose weight really quickly in the first week. I am a dietitian who you probably have already picked up is very much about individually tailoring. So I'm not for or against keto. Some people I will put on it, some people I will take off it. It's all about what's best for the individual. But the key thing that you guys need to know is that your carbohydrate intake can impact upon your fluid balance. And so if you're having, say you have no carbs throughout the day, maybe you're doing some type of intermittent fasting diet where you don't eat anything until lunchtime, and then at lunchtime you just have some fish and salad, and then you have a hard-boiled egg in the afternoon and some nuts, and then you go out and have a big bowl of pasta. your fluid levels are going to be affected by that irregular carbohydrate throughout the day. So again, what I would be encouraging you to be doing to optimize your Menieres as much as possible is not only trying to space your meals evenly across the day, but also to space your carbohydrate distribution across the day. So that means you don't want to, like I said, have fish and salad, so having no carbs for lunch, and then for dinner go to a Italian restaurant or even at home have a massive big bowl of pasta where you're having 8 serves of grains and a slice of bread. It's just going to impact upon your fluid levels too much. Number 5 thing to think about is that there is a little bit of research, not a lot, but a little bit, around food sensitivities. And so again, this is something else that you just might want to think about. So some research suggests that about 30% of people may also have some type of food sensitivity. And that's because the inner ear is a target for food allergy activity that can lead to inflammation and increased permeability and fluid balance disruption. So studies report that people who have used food elimination treatments for food allergies have decreased the frequency and duration of their episodes and had some improvements in symptoms compared to a control group with no treatment. So this might be also something that you might like to work through and try. And then the last area that you might want to look into is caffeine and alcohol. So high levels of caffeine and or alcohol in the diet may lead to vasoconstriction and hence a reduced blood supply to the ear, which may exacerbate your symptoms. However, the restriction of caffeine in the diet to help alleviate symptoms is again poorly researched and its effect is unknown. So in normal circumstances, a high caffeine intake will make people unsteady. So moderate intakes of caffeine in particular are recommended. So what is a moderate intake? Well, according to the best available research at the moment that I could find, it's less than 100 milligrams of caffeine per day. And I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. But the other good thing to know about caffeine and alcohol is that symptoms tend to start relatively quickly. So it's usually quite easy to identify whether this is going to be a trigger for you personally or not. So just remembering that I said for most people it's less than 100 milligrams of caffeine a day. So one espresso is around 150 to 200 milligrams of caffeine. So for most people that's probably going to be too much. Remembering also that you're going to get different, so you'll see it's 150 to 200 milligrams. So that will really change depending upon the coffee bean, how it's ground, where you're getting it from, a whole range of different things. And so this is where there is some variation from cup to cup, which you have to take into consideration as well. A cup of black tea is usually around 50 milligrams of caffeine. So you may be able to tolerate 1 to 2 cups of tea a day. A can of energy drink, I would suggest that it's probably not going to be a great choice for you, nor is something like a Pepsi or a Coca-Cola or some type of caffeine drink, because not only do you have the caffeine, but you also have the sugar in these. You could be thinking, well, what about if I'm having a diet version with no sugar? That's probably going to be a better choice, certainly. And obviously can get the caffeine-free versions now, like the decaffeinated ones, and that would be a better choice again. Being the dietitian, I would encourage you to stay away from them altogether, but you know, if that's your guilty pleasure and we're taking so much else out of your diet, then so be it. Again, you've got to be practical and think about what's going to work for you. If I was going to have caffeine, this would be where I'd be spending my caffeine budget. It's more so in the chocolate area. So usually it depends upon, again, the percentage of cocoa in your chocolate, but around 10 squares of a dark chocolate has got around 60 milligrams of caffeine, or around 10 milligrams in milk chocolate. So that kind of is the overview that I wanted to go through in terms of the most common areas. And now I'm going to go through your questions, these live questions first, and then I'll go on to the precinct questions. So Tiff says, is there sodium in things like Nurofen Zavance? Yeah, there can be. That's a great question, Tiff. So you're right in that there's it's not just food that contains sodium, but things like medications and also supplements can sometimes have not massive amounts of sodium, but they often do have small amounts of sodium. So if you are really focusing on a very tight sodium restriction, they may be areas to look for where you may have some hidden sodium. Sandra asks, could excessive fluid in the ears be controlled via diet, or would that be totally related? No. So Sandra, I guess that's what I was trying to say, is that yes, excessive fluid in the ears could be potentially controlled by a diet. And so that's where you want to be looking at all of those things that I was talking about tonight. And I'd recommend doing them one at a time, because sodium, alcohol, caffeine, meal distribution, fluid intake, and carbohydrate intake can all potentially impact the amount of fluid that your body holds onto, and therefore the amount of fluid in your ears. Does this mean that doing a fasting diet would not be helpful to us? For example, Michael Mosley's diet, where you fast for 16 hours and only eat across 8 hours of the day. Great question, Tiff. So probably it depends on you as an individual, because there are a lot of factors to consider. A fasting diet like that, why I'm kind of hesitating is that there's a lot of variety in those fasting diets. So say you are only eating for 8 hours, the question is, during those 8 hours, are you getting into ketosis, which means are you having a carbohydrate restriction or not? And is that something that you need and is beneficial for you as an individual or not? Are you just doing it short term, or are you doing it lifelong? So there's quite a few questions that I would want to know as to whether or not I'd be recommending that for you or not. But in general, I would say that it's probably best for you to avoid that unless you have a really good reason to do it, and and kind of know what you're doing, because there's a good chance that it may very well bring on symptoms for you. Anne's got another really interesting question. So she says, can you live without salt? And what are good natural foods for sodium? Can you live without salt? That's a really good question. Salt and sodium is actually one of the few foods that, sodium is one of the few nutrients that when we look at our dietary recommendations, so if you go through all the vitamins and minerals and so forth, as a dietitian, we always have recommendations of what the average person needs, and then how much is too much and is going to cause toxicity, and then how much is not enough. And so sodium is one of the few foods where the research shows that they're actually unsure if you can have too lower sodium levels, or not sodium levels, but too lower sodium intake. So it seems to suggest that you need to have at least 200 milligrams of sodium per day. But it's actually really quite difficult to get sodium levels to get a sodium intake that low. I do see people who have very low sodium intakes with things like if they have some type of like vomiting condition. So say in pregnancy with a woman who's got hyperemesis gravidium, where she's just vomiting, and just not able to eat anything. And not only not able to eat anything, but she's also losing salt and sodium through her vomiting. Then one of the first things that a doctor is going to do is put her onto an IV drip with some sodium and usually some dextrose, so usually some carbohydrate in it to help to rehydrate her again. We also see it in eating clients where they're really restricting their food intake, but they might also be they might be eating fruits and vegetables, but a very low sodium intake. And again, sometimes, so it's hard to know whether it's the sodium or whether it's because when you're reducing all that sodium, you're usually reducing all of that carbohydrate and all those calories and things as well. So again, those eating disorder clients often are becoming quite confused and dizzy and problems like that, but they usually they'll often present with a very low blood pressure and those types of issues. So generally, I don't think that there's much benefit for restricting your sodium levels much lower than 800 milligrams would be, I guess, my perspective. Somewhere between 600 to 800 milligrams would probably be as low as I would go. So this is another good question from, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, Regina, is that how I say it? She says, do you get leg cramps due to very low sodium diets? So yeah, you can. And it's not really just due to the low sodium diets, but again, it's due to the fact that you're then you're not retaining the fluid. So yes, that can be a side effect. What I would be considering if you are on a strong sodium restriction is, number one, stretching daily. Number two is consider taking some magnesium supplements. And then number three would be consider some potassium chloride might be helpful as well. And then your question about can you have too little salt in your diet, I think I just answered that question. So hopefully that's okay. Yeah, so this is a question. This is a good question too. Are there any foods that are that naturally act as a diuretic, like dandelion tea? Yes, absolutely. So like dandelion tea. So yes, there are foods that act as a diuretic. So like I was saying before, if you're having a keto diet or a low carb diet, which I'm not necessarily advocating for you because it's really hard to sustain long term, but that has a diuretic effect. And then yes, there are foods like dandelion tea as well that do have a diuretic effect. It would be helpful to know the food amounts for the sodium in your tables. I've been working on milligrams of sodium per 100 grams of food, which is usually easy to check. Oh, sorry, Gary. Yeah. Yeah, we might be able to put something together for you. And but you can always, so yeah, you'll obviously be able to see the amount of sodium in the foods that you're eating. And I guess the reason why we haven't done it per 100 grams is that you don't always eat 100 grams of food. So you actually, that's why I wanted to show you in actual real food terms how much sodium people might be having those different food tables. So if you are looking for the amount of sodium in a different food, first of all, you can look on the back of the food label. Secondly, you can go to apps like MyFitnessPal, or also websites like calorieking.com.au. Or thirdly, you can go to the Food Standards Authority of Australia and New Zealand, which is fsans.com.au, or no, I think it's .org.au, and they've got the databases that everybody makes their food labels from, and so you can go in there to look up foods, and that's also where you'll get the amount of sodium on things like the fruits and vegetables and so forth. Carol says, how would we know if we're salt sensitive or not? Great question, Carol. Is it just about trialing a low sodium diet to see if it helps symptoms or not? Yes, that would be the best way to do it. Otherwise, it's a genetic test. So I wouldn't bother with the genetic test. I would just do it via trialing to see if it works for you or not. And what testing would you recommend regarding food allergy assessment? I wouldn't recommend testing for a food allergy assessment. I again would recommend an elimination diet. So just trialing one thing at a time to see what works for you, because the testing that's available isn't relevant to Meniere's. So yeah, I wouldn't do that. What can you do if you get a UTI? Isn't urine high in sodium? Yes, urine is very high in sodium. That is a great question. I would probably, so first of all, if I can just give a caveat and say, again, it's a hard question to answer in a broad forum like this, because I don't know whether you're trying to just how low your sodium restriction should be, what you're trying to do with your fluid intake, what you're trying to do with your carbohydrate intake, etc. But I guess what I would be pointing you in the direction of is, number one, thinking about cranberry, whether it's a cranberry juice or cranberry tablets, and number two, thinking about probiotics. So neither of those are going to be as good as Ural, but if Ural isn't an option for you, then those two things may be things that you can at least try. The other thing is, are you on a fluid restriction, or are you trying to increase your fluid intake? If you're trying to increase your fluid intake, then that's going to be a really good, that's going to be your best choice, is really ramping up your fluid intake. All right, now, how am I going for time? Oh, pushing it. I'm going to try and get through some of these questions if I can. Lynn or Anne, give me a yell out if you want to cut me short, and I could just email through the questions or something, like the answers or something along those lines. So yeah, let me know. Okay, number one, do I agree with the view that sugar consumption, particularly processed sugar, is much more hazardous to health than the consumption of fat, even if it's a trans fat, as put forward by the likes of Dr. Robert Lustig? So no, I don't agree with that. I, again, think that it depends upon the individual and what that individual's targets and goals are. And so for some people, the focus should be more so on limiting saturated fat intake, but for some people, it should be more about limiting sugar intake. And it also depends on, so many things, like how much physical activity are you doing? What's your weight like? What other health conditions have you got? So my answer to that is that it depends on the individual. Next one. If you have Meniere's disease and get diabetes, then would you pretty much have to eat cardboard? If a food is not high in sodium, then most of the foods are high in sugar content. I see this as a double whammy for a Meniere's patient. Can you comment? So first of all, it's always really unfair when people have got more than one dietary condition. But I guess as a dietitian, I see it a lot, because often when people have one dietary condition, they know how to treat it. But when they've got two, they're like, oh, this is getting way too complex for me. What do I do? I actually think, though, with Meniere's and diabetes, there's actually a lot of overlap, because for people who have got diabetes, they have a significantly increased risk of heart disease. So they're often advised to keep their salt intake low, well, not necessarily as restricted as Meniere's, but certainly less than 2,000 milligrams a day to reduce their risk of heart disease and stroke. We're also, for people with diabetes, looking at their meal distribution, evenly distributing that throughout the day, and their carbohydrate distribution throughout the day. So there's actually a fair bit of overlap. So they're the things that I guess I would be encouraging you to do if you do have both diabetes and Meniere's, is look at your meal distribution, look at your carbohydrate distribution. Yes, keep sugar intake low. Yes, potentially keep your sodium intake low, like work out what's the right amount of sodium restriction for you, and then focus on nutritious nourishment. Going to be low in sodium, so things like your lean proteins, low GI grains, fruit, veggies, dairy, like all those good unprocessed foods. The next question. I know how important a low sodium diet is for Meniere's. How much sugar, I like this question, how much sugar and chocolate can we safely have, or is it important just to avoid them altogether? So again, it's going to depend on you and your unique restrictions, but I generally would say that although chocolate contains sugar, it actually has a low glycemic index because of the fat in the chocolate slows down how quickly the sugar in the chocolate breaks down. And although you need to consider the caffeine in the chocolate, if that's something that affects you, if you are somebody who can tolerate up to 100 milligrams of caffeine a day, then you may be able to tolerate up to 16 squares of chocolate a day. So that is my answer for that question. Okay, next one is sauces like soy and teriyaki are a no-no. So what's some spicy replacements that I could have? Well, first of all, fresh chili is going to be an amazing choice. Then also any other fresh herbs like coriander, mint, basil, or parsley. You can also use some dried spices like paprika, flavoured olive oils like the lemon-infused olive oil or the garlic-infused olive oil. You can use some aged balsamic vinegar, which has a umami taste sensation, which actually is a great way to not give you it doesn't replace salt, but it is probably the closest thing that you're going to get. So the aged balsamic, I love it in a salad. It's a little bit thicker than regular balsamic, and you can just buy it from the supermarket. And yeah, it's quite delicious. So that might be something to consider as well. Next one, what are recommendations for sugar snack alternatives? So first of all, it depends on, first of all, I've broken this down into two categories. The first one is foods where you're going to get your natural sugars. So foods that have got natural sugars are going to be things like fruit and Greek yogurt, tzatziki, maybe some, you might have some feta with some, what would you have feta with? I don't know, with some celery sticks or something along those lines. So there'd be some snacks if you're happy to have natural sugars. If you're trying to have no sugars, then consider some unsalted nuts, a hard-boiled egg, half an avocado with some lemon juice, or some carrot or celery sticks with some homemade hummus so that it doesn't have any excess salt in it. Question then, are vitamin supplements worth taking, or can we rely 100% on food if we have a balanced diet? So you can rely 100% on food if you have a balanced diet. But if you are thinking about cutting out food groups, then you are probably going to need supplements. Saying all of that, there was a lot of there was some research that I found that observed a trend in vitamin D deficiency and Meniere's. So that is something that I would recommend that you get tested if you haven't had that tested already. And then if you're somebody who doesn't eat fish because of the anti-inflammatory benefits of omega-3, which is mainly found from fish, if you're somebody who doesn't eat fish for whatever reason, I would recommend considering a algal omega-3 supplement as well. And then you may also like to try anti-inflammatory supplements like garlic and ginger and turmeric, if they're not things that you want to have in your diet. So, yeah.
Okay, that's it.